Welcome, everyone. My name is Paul Phillips. I am the Content Development Director for ISACA, and I am so excited because we have recently updated our IT Audit and Assurance Framework, also known as ITAF. And I have with me today Mary Carmichael, the developer of the newly updated framework. And she's going to spend some time today talking to you about the highlights, some of the things that was updated in the framework, and just give you a high-level overview of the publication. So Mary, take it away.
Oh, thank you, Paul, for that introduction. My name is Mary Carmichael, and I'm a CPA. And I was part of a global team last year that reviewed ITAF 4, which was released back in 2020, and is seeing what are the shifts that are happening in audit, and how do we need to update ITAF to reflect the new expectations, especially when it comes to technology, when it comes to auditing. So auditing is operating in a very different environment from the one that many of our audit methods were originally built for. Technology is no longer just a back office enabler. It is increasingly dependent on how the business runs, so how decisions are made and how risk moves across systems, third parties, and digital ecosystems. So as that reality changes, the expectations of audit are changing with it. And that's why the ITAF 5 updates matter, because 6 years from ITAF 4 to ITAF 5 is a long wait, especially when it comes to technology changes. So today, I want to focus on what the updates mean in practice, not just what the framework says, but how it changes the way we scope our work, assess risk, evaluate evidence, and communicate value as auditors. So with this, there are 5 things I want you to leave with today after this podcast. First, why ITAF 5 was updated and the changing expectations behind it. Second, how audit and assurance is expanding beyond individual systems into broader digital ecosystems. Third, what that means across the audit lifecycle, from planning through reporting to follow-up. Fourth, the capabilities auditors need when environments are more dynamic and decisions are also more automated. And lastly, how audit can play a more strategic role earlier in the decision cycle without compromising independence or objectivity. So today's podcast is about understanding what ITAF updates means for the work we do as auditors. So let me start with a situation that will feel, I'm assuming, familiar to many auditors. So you begin what looks like a straightforward audit. So on paper, the scope seems clear: one system, one process, one control area. But as the work progresses, you realize the real issue is not where you expect it to be. It might be an interface or a third party, or potentially in a dependency no one fully understood. Or it could be involved in handoffs between teams where ownership was assumed but never really defined. So for me, that is one of the clearest ways to understand why ITAF 5 matters. Because if I had to summarize this podcast in one sentence, it would be this: the fundamentals of audit have not changed, but the environment we audit has changed significantly, and that is the shift. Audit is still expected to be independent, evidence-based, risk-focused, and grounded in professional judgment. But the environment around that work is more interconnected, more technology-dependent, and also more dynamic than before. So technology is no longer just supporting the business in the background. It is increasingly how the business operates, how decisions are made, how customers are served, and how risk moves. And that's why ITAF 5 matters now. So before we get into what has changed, I think it helps to anchor on what ITAF is there to do. At its core, ITAF is still a professional foundation for IT audit and assurance. So it gives us a more structured way to plan our work, perform the work, and also report on the results. It helps make audit more consistent, more credible, and also more grounded in professional standards. And that foundation still matters. In fact, I would say it matters even more now with our complex environment, because the more dynamic and interconnected things become, the easier it is for our audit teams to rely on familiar methods that no longer fully match where the real risk sits. And the structure itself is still familiar. You still have your standards which help define what is required. You have guidelines which helps explain how those requirements can be applied in practice. And you have tools and techniques which support execution. And within that structure, ITAF is organized into general standards, performance standards, as well as reporting standards. So I'll just do a quick recap on what those standards mean. The general standards deal with the foundations of credible audit work. That includes independence, objectivity, due professional care, proficiency, as well as criteria. The performance standards deal with how the work gets done. That includes planning, supervision, evidence, and the use of experts. And the reporting standards focus on the communication of results and follow-up activities. So the framework itself is still recognizable, but what is really changing is how we apply it. And that's why ITAF 5 was refreshed. ITAF reflects the reality that the environment audit teams are expected to assess has changed. So now we're dealing with cloud environments, AI, IoT, complex digital ecosystems, and also expanding third-party dependencies. At the same time, the way we perform audit work is changing too. Teams are using more analytics, more automation, and in some areas, more continuous risk-based approaches to understand whether controls and monitoring processes are working. That also means the expectations of auditors are changing. Teams need broader capability, not just in audit, but in areas like data, cybersecurity, AI, and third-party risk. So the best way to think about ITAF is not that it's giving audit a completely new purpose. This is not a reset. It's making the framework more explicit about what modern assurance now requires. And that includes clearer thinking about criteria and evidence, better use of analytics and specialist support where needed, stronger reporting on business impact, and also more meaningful follow-up on unresolved or evolving risks. And that's really an evolution of our audit practice. So just to summarize, ITAF 5 is not asking audit to become something new. It's asking audit to respond to a new environment. And one useful way to think about ITAF 5 is to take a look at our audit lifecycle. The lifecycle itself has not changed. You still plan, perform field work, report, and follow up. But each stage has to adapt to a more digital, stronger operating environment. So in planning, that means broadening the scope, mapping the ecosystem around what we're auditing, assessing impact more carefully, and also being more deliberate about criteria we're going to use. In fieldwork, it may mean rely on more analytics, reviewing the architecture and data flows more directly, automating parts of evidence collection, and involving specialists where complexity of the risk calls for it. In reporting, it means going beyond tracking action items and focusing more directly on whether or not we're describing the emerging risk exposure appropriately, not just a control observation. And then with the follow-up, we need to be more explicit about whether or not that exposure is being managed or still remains. And that last point matters a lot. A lot of follow-up still becomes more of an administration process, like more of a status update, whether it's open, closed, delayed, or in progress. But the better question is not just whether an item has changed status. The better question is whether the risk is actually lower. The follow-up should become more of an exposure exercise, not a status exercise in terms of a check mark. So what does this all mean in practice? And for me, it comes down to 6 major shifts in how audit and assurance needs to be applied in today's environment. So I will walk through the next 6 shifts for you, and this is mostly where the presentation of this podcast will focus on. So these 6 shifts, once again, are the backbone of this podcast. So first, we move from systems to ecosystems. Second, we move from controls to outcomes. Third, we move from periodic reviews to continuous assurance thinking. Fourth, we move from sampling to more data-driven testing. Fifth, we move from operations to governance. And finally, the role of audit itself shifts from an after-the-fact reviewer to an earlier risk advisor. And if you remember these 6 shifts, you will remember the ITAF 5 updates are all about. So now I'm going to walk through each shift in more detail. So let's start with the first shift, from systems to ecosystems. For a long time, it was natural to scope an audit around a system. So maybe you're auditing payroll or an ERP or identity management or maybe even a reporting platform. And that felt manageable. But today, very few important business processes sit neatly inside one application. So let's explore this. Let's take payroll as an example. So on paper, payroll sounds like one system. But in reality, it may depend on a timekeeping platform, identity access services, API connections, cloud infrastructure, downstream finance reporting, or even one or more external providers. So now imagine this. So the timekeeping feed fails on Wednesday, payroll runs on Friday, and no one notices the break until pay is logged. And by the time the issue shows up, what looked like a payroll issue is really an integration issue, a monitoring issue, as well as an ownership issue. That is why the stronger audit question is no longer, did we audit the system? It is now, did we understand the ecosystem that system or that application depends on? And that changes planning in a very practical way. It means mapping out dependencies, understanding data flows, being clear about control boundaries, and asking the bigger question. If one part of this fails, does the issue stay contained? Or does it create a much more larger problem across the environment? So with this shift, the better scope starts with dependencies, not just applications. So understanding the environment that you're operating in. So now let's discuss the second shift in ITAF, from controls to outcomes. And this second shift is about what we are trying to conclude on. So traditionally, audit focused on controls. Was the control designed properly? Did it operate effectively? Was the approval there? And was access restricted? Those questions still matter. But today, they're no longer enough on their own. You may be wondering, why is that? Because organizations are increasingly relying on technology-driven outcomes. This includes automated approvals, recommendation logic, workflow routing, and AI-supported decisions. So I guess to me, the question gets bigger. It's no longer, did the control work? It becomes, can we trust the outcome? So a good example of this involves an AI-enabled loan approval process. And we're going to walk through this example. So if management says the model is performing well, that sounds reassuring. But as an auditor, that statement's still too vague. You still need to ask, what does that actually mean? Does it mean the data can be trusted? Does it mean the model performance is monitored? Does it mean exceptions are reviewed? Does it mean changes are controlled? Or does it mean the logic is explainable enough for independent challenge? And that is why criteria and evidence matters so much here. You cannot rely on broad assurance. You need clear basins for what good looks like. You need enough evidence to support that conclusion. So what this means is evidence becomes more layered in a digital operating environment. So with these environments, stronger evidence usually means more than one artifact. It often means evidence of design, evidence of what actually ran, evidence of monitoring, and evidence that management reviewed or even challenged the output. So if a dashboard tells me everything is working, I still need to ask who controls the system, whether the underlying data is complete, and whether the output can be confirmed. And when this comes to newer areas like AI, the criteria needs to be more explicit too. Instead of saying something should be well governed, we need to ask, what does that actually mean in audible terms? So for example, is the ownership clear? Are changes approved or outputs monitored? And are the exceptions logged? And is the process is explainable enough for an independent review? So the question is no longer, whether or not the control worked. It's whether or not the result can be trusted. And that's the main takeaway from this shift. So now let's move on to the third shift that's happening with ITAF, from periodic review to more continuous assurance thinking. So this third shift is about timing. So a lot of traditional audit methods assumed what I call a relatively stable environment between reviews. That assumption is much weaker now. So let's talk about today's environment. Change is constant. There's new releases, new configurations, vendors update things, access changes, cloud environments scale, there's always new integrations appearing. So when we audit, in a point of time, the risk does not pause. It keeps moving. And that creates a gap between when we test and what is happening in the environment. That is a blind spot. Now, that does not mean audit becomes continuous monitoring. Continuous monitoring is still owned by management. What it does mean is that audit increasingly needs to evaluate whether management's monitoring processes are reliable, complete, and producing meaningful signals. So let's talk about an example involving configuration drift. Suppose an AWS S3 policy changes in a way that weakens access restrictions. Audit's not there to run the monitoring tool, but audit does need to understand whether that change would be detected, whether someone would review it, and whether actions would be taken. That same logic applies to privileged access changes, infrastructure changes, and also transaction anomalies. And this is where a common concern comes up. Is continuous assurance realistic? I think the answer is yes, but only if we define it properly. Continuous assurance does not mean audit is trying to watch everything in real time. It means taking a more selective risk-based approach to determine whether key monitoring and control process can be relied upon in an environment that changes quickly. So yes, the challenges are real. Scope creep in this area in terms of adding more to monitor, and also there's capability gaps are real. But independence boundaries are real. So yes, I think it's realistic, but only if it's targeted, practical, and clearly kept on the side within assurance's role. So here the risk is not control failure, it's more audit lag. So now I want to move to the fourth shift that's mentioned in ITAF, from sampling to more data-driven testing. The fourth shift is about testing. Sampling still has a place, but in many digital environments, it does not give enough visibility. And that is because risk often shows up in patterns, anomalies, or scale. So let's take retail payment processing transactions as an example. So in that environment, millions of transactions may move through our process every day. At that scale, a small sample may miss the issue that matters most. It may miss a duplicate transactions across systems, maybe coordinate fraud patterns, pricing logic issues that affect large volumes of small sales, or unusual refund behavior that doesn't arise above the typical sample threshold. And that's why data-driven testing matters. And so instead of testing a sample, auditors may need to take a look at the full flow of transactions and identify where the risk sits at. And then they can use analytics to identify anomalies, understand the root cause, and evaluate whether controls are working. But there's an important caution that belongs here. The more data does not automatically mean more assurance. So coverage may increase, but assurance still depends on whether the data is complete, whether the logic is sound, and whether the conclusions reached with professional judgment. So I do not say more analytics does not automatically mean better audit. It just means broader visibility. And more coverage does not remove judgment. It makes judgment even more important. Now I can speak about the fifth shift, moving from operations to governance. And the fifth shift is about where audit puts in its focus. So many technology failures begin not with one isolated control failure, but with weak oversight, maybe unclear accountability, poor governance, or even inadequate escalation. And that is why technology risk increasingly has to be treated as a business risk. Audit has to evaluate governance as well as operations. So let's take a major cloud outage as an example of this. So the immediate reaction is often to ask, what failed technically? Was it a configuration issue? Was it a control breakdown? But the more useful audit question may be why the organization was so exposed to that failure in the first place. Were critical services overly concentrated in one region or in one provider? Did the organization understand those dependencies? Were resilience expectations realistic? And did decision makers have visibility into the actual exposure? Those are governance questions. And that is where audit becomes more valuable, not just by pointing out that something failed, but by explaining why the organization was so exposed in the first place. And that changes reporting. So if the deeper issue is weak oversight, poor visibility, or unmanaged dependency risk, the report needs to say that clearly in a way that leadership can act. So the deeper issue is often exposure, not just failure. And that's what governance reviews or audits undertake. So now I want to speak about the last shift, the sixth shift. So from the after the fact reviewer to the earliest risk advisor. So this sixth shift is about timing and role. Traditionally, audit often came in after decisions were made, after systems went live, or when issues emerged. But by that point, many of the biggest risks were already embedded. So the opportunity now is for the audit team to engage earlier, not to take over decisions, but to ask better questions sooner. That might mean asking whether the organization is relying too heavily on a single platform. It might mean asking whether automation could scale a failure very quickly. Or it might mean asking whether the dependencies behind a decision were actually understood. And that is where audit becomes more valuable. But boundaries matters as well. Audit can advise on risk. Audit can challenge assumptions. Audit can raise concerns. But audit cannot own the decision or approve the outcome. So a simple way to say it is like this. Audit can influence the conversations, but it cannot own the outcome. And that's what protects independence. And for smaller and maybe less technically mature teams, this is where realism matters. Not every team is going to build every capability at once. And that's not the expectations when it comes to providing this forward-looking insight. So part of that is understanding more your roadmap in terms of areas of improvement, in terms of undertaking that more forward-looking insight. And that's probably the next part of this podcast is given me 6 shifts, what can I do to understand what are my gaps and how do I move forward in terms of embracing these 6 shifts? So this is where I have a question for you. Is audit ready for its next role? Technology is no longer just something we audit. It's how the business operates, delivers value, and creates risk. So the question I have for you is, do we have the capabilities to audit it effectively? And this is where I want to speak more about the capabilities as well as the technology strategy that audit teams will need to develop. So all these 6 shifts have implications for capability. So if audit is expected to assess digital ecosystems, trusted outcomes, dynamic environments, and governance over technology risks, then the function needs broader capabilities than traditional control testing alone. This includes stronger data literacy, more comfort with cloud and architecture concepts, more fluency in AI governance, and automated decisions, and a better ability to connect technical findings back to the business risk and impact to the organization. This is also where it helps to reconnect to the ITAF fundamentals. So before taking on any, these kind of technology engagements, audit still needs proficiency, deep professional care, appropriate planning, risk assessment, and sufficient evidence. Those are not old concepts that become less relevant in modern environments. If anything, they become more important as an environment becomes more complex. And this is where specialist support is needed. ITAF is clear that using specialists does not remove audit responsibility. The auditor still needs to assess the expert's competency and relevance, determine whether the work can be relied upon, and also retain responsibility for the final conclusion. But before I get into the technology strategy and the tools, I do want to speak more about this one's been the technology expectations. Because once again, the strategy is about goals. It's not really about a collection of tools. So the goal is not to digitize everything. The goal is to support how audit needs to evolve. So most teams already feel the pressure to cover more data, move faster, reduce manual effort, and get better insight into risks. So the question is not about whether technology matters. The question is where technology can help the most in your operations. So if the challenge is visibility, stronger monitoring may help. If the challenge is testing at scale, analytics may help. If the challenge is about making sense of the information, risk intelligence may help. And if the tools do not connect to any workflows, reporting, or how the teams operates, they will not help much, no matter how good they are. So this is not about adding more technology for the sake about it. It's about being intentional. So now, as we close this podcast, I do want to bring together these concepts. So the most important message from ITAF 5 is that audit remains grounded in strong standards, but the way we apply those standards has to reflect the reality of the digital enterprise. So the key takeaways, you may be wondering, what does this actually mean in practice? So start by expanding your lens. Risk doesn't sit neatly in systems anymore. It sits across connected environments. You also will need to shift your mindset. Don't ask if the controls work. Ask if the outcomes can be trusted. Speed matters too. Audit needs to keep up with how quickly things change. And also you need to strengthen your evidence. Use data, automation, also having the right expertise available for your engagements. And most importantly, elevate the conversation. Focus on governance, engage earlier, and communicate business impact. And that's how audit will remain relevant in today's digital enterprises. So now you may be wondering, how do I make these shifts successfully? Because right now it does seem like a big jump. And the good news is that you do not have to transform everything at once. The most practical place to start is with a gap analysis. Look at your current audit methodology and ask, where is it still being built for more of a static world? And from there, build the capabilities that matter the most. That may mean stronger data literacy, a better understanding of cloud environments, or simply getting more comfortable with AI governance fundamentals. And then start small. Pick one engagement where the current approach is clearly under pressure. Maybe that is a pilot for continuous assurance, or maybe it is one area where you introduce more data-driven testing. But the point here is not to modernize audit overnight. The point is to move more deliberately. And that is where ITAF really helps. It gives you the standards, the guidance, and the credibility to evolve your approach in a way that is practical, defensible, and relevant. And I'll close the podcast with this. The fundamentals of audit have not changed. You still need independence, objectivity, professional judgment, sufficient evidence, and clear reporting. What has changed is that we're auditing how the technology environment, how businesses now use technology, and also how risk behaves around it. So as I want to reiterate, technology increasingly runs the business. It impacts customer experience, operations, financial processes, resilience, and decision-making. ITAF 5 helps ensure that insurance and audit remains credible in that reality. And I think that's the most important takeaway from the framework update. So thank you for your time. So ITAF 5 is available as a free download from the ISACA website. And so thank you again for listening to the podcast and learning more about the shifts that the ITAF 5 documents and helps the audit profession move forward with its evolution.